Ma'am, you need to step out of first class. Now. The words landed sharper than they should have, slicing through the quiet hum of the cabin at 36,000 feet. And for a moment, every eye in row 2 lifted in sync, drawn not by volume but by certainty, the kind that assumes it's right before anyone dares question it. And Danielle Carter didn't move, not immediately. Not even when the flight attendant standing beside her folded her arms and took a half-step closer, as if proximity alone could rewrite reality, because Danielle had seen this before. Not this exact seat, not this exact plane, but this exact look, the quiet calculation behind someone's eyes deciding who belongs and who doesn't. And she exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, like someone who understood that reactions were currency and she wasn't about to spend hers cheaply. Her outfit simple, a fitted charcoal t-shirt, dark jeans, white sneakers that had crossed more boardrooms than most suits ever would. Nothing about her screamed power, and that was the point. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy blazer leaned toward his companion and whispered something under his breath, a smirk following close behind. While 2 rows back, a young woman paused mid-scroll on her phone, sensing the shift in the air, that subtle tightening that happens right before something breaks. I said, "You're in the wrong seat," the attendant repeated, louder this time, her tone no longer neutral but edged with impatience. And still Danielle didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for her ticket, didn't argue. She simply looked up, calm, present, unshaken, as if the entire moment existed on a different timeline than the one everyone else was reacting to. Because in her mind, this wasn't escalation. It was confirmation of a pattern she had learned to read long before she ever owned anything that could fly, long before her name carried weight in rooms people like this attendant would never see. And somewhere between the silence and the stares, the cabin began to divide, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet American way where judgment travels faster than facts. "People always try this," the attendant added, just loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. And that was when the temperature shifted, not in the air, but in the energy, because now it wasn't just a correction, it was a narrative, and narratives have consequences. Danielle tilted her head slightly, studying the woman in front of her, not with anger, not with offense, but with something far more unsettling, recognition, as if she had already seen the ending to this moment and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, steady, deliberate, unmoved, while the engines roared outside like nothing unusual was happening at all, and maybe to everyone else, nothing was. Just another passenger, just another seat dispute, just another story they'd forget before landing. But Danielle knew better, because moments like this didn't disappear, they revealed. And as the attendant reached for her tablet to verify, as the whispers grew just a little louder, as the cabin leaned ever so slightly toward assumption over truth, Danielle finally spoke, her voice low, measured, unmistakably calm. "You're about to make a very expensive mistake." The attendant let out a short, dismissive breath as if the warning meant nothing, as if Danielle's calm tone was just another attempt to sound important, and she tapped her tablet with exaggerated confidence, her fingers moving fast, but her eyes never leaving Danielle's face, searching for hesitation, for panic, for anything that would confirm the story she had already decided was true. But there was nothing there, no shift, no crack, just stillness, the kind that unsettled people who relied on control to feel certain. "We have procedures for this," she said, louder now, drawing the attention of a few more passengers who leaned subtly into the moment, pretending not to watch while watching everything. And Danielle simply nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she had heard those exact words in different places, different cities, different years, all carrying the same weight, all hiding the same assumption. And across the aisle the man in the navy blazer chuckled, under his breath again, this time not bothering to hide it. "They always say something like that," he muttered to his companion. And that word always lingered in the air longer than it should have, stretching across the cabin like a quiet accusation, while 2 seats behind, the young woman with the phone shifted forward slightly, her brows pulling together as doubt began to replace curiosity, because something about this did not feel right. Not the tone, not the confidence, not the way the woman in the seat remained completely unshaken. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to stand up," The attendant continued, her voice tightening as the expected compliance failed to arrive, and she gestured toward the aisle, as if the motion itself could enforce authority. But Danielle did not move, not out of defiance, but out of certainty. Her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, her presence anchored in a way that made the request feel smaller than it sounded, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, the attendant hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to register internally, because people who are sure do not pause, and yet she did. Is there a problem here? Another crew member approached from the galley, a taller man with a clipped tone and a practiced expression, already aligning himself with the situation before understanding it, and the attendant responded quickly. Unverified passenger in first class, refusing to comply. Each word placed carefully, building a narrative that sounded official, structured, justified, and the man nodded as if that was all he needed, turning his attention to Danielle with a look that had already reached a conclusion. Miss, we can resolve this easily if you cooperate, he said, and the word cooperate hung heavy, because it implied resistance, and resistance implied guilt, and the cabin absorbed that implication without question, except for one voice, quiet but clear, from just behind them. I saw her check in. The young woman spoke up, her voice not loud but steady enough to cut through the rehearsed authority, and both crew members turned, surprised, not by the words but by the interruption, because witnesses were never part of the plan, and Danielle's eyes flicked briefly in that direction, a small acknowledgement, almost invisible, but intentional, and then she looked back at the attendant, her expression unchanged, her voice even. You should double-check before you escalate this any further, she said, not as a threat, not as a plea, but as a statement, and something in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in glass that no one can unsee once it appears. The male crew member shifted his stance slightly, the confidence in his posture still there, but no longer as solid as it had been seconds ago, because doubt, once introduced, does not need permission to spread. It moves quietly, slipping between assumptions and settling into places people do not expect, and he glanced at the attendant's tablet again, this time not just to confirm but to verify, a subtle difference that only Danielle seemed to notice, because she had seen this moment before, the exact second when certainty begins to fracture under the weight of possibility, and still she did not move, her hands resting calmly, her gaze steady, allowing the silence to do what arguments never could. There is no executive flag on this seat, the attendant said quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could replace accuracy, and she turned the screen slightly toward him, careful not to reveal too much, just enough to maintain control of the narrative. But the hesitation was already there, lingering in the edges of her voice, and behind them the young woman leaned forward again, more confident now. I watched her boarding pass scan green, she said, louder this time, and that word green carried weight, because in a system built on validation, green meant approved, green meant allowed, green meant she belonged, and the male crew member's jaw tightened slightly as he processed that, because now there were two versions of the same moment, and only one of them could be true. Miss, where is your boarding pass? He asked, turning back to Danielle, his tone more measured, less certain, and Danielle reached slowly into her pocket, not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate, and handed it to him without a word, the paper smooth, uncreased, official, and for a brief moment, the cabin held its breath, because proof changes things, it shifts the balance, it forces people to confront what they would rather ignore, and as he scanned it with his device, the small screen lit up, a soft tone followed, and there it was again, green, unmistakable, undeniable, and yet the attendant stepped in before he could speak. That system has glitches sometimes, she said, her voice sharper now, pushing back against the reality unfolding in front of her, because accepting it would mean unraveling everything she had already committed to, and unraveling in front of a full cabin was not something she was willing to do. We have had incidents before, she added, layering justification over doubt, while across the aisle the man in the navy blazer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence fading as the situation grew more complicated than he had expected, and the young woman behind them shook her head slightly, disbelief replacing curiosity, because now it was no longer about a misunderstanding, It was about refusal. Refusal to acknowledge what was clearly in front of them. And Danielle watched it all unfold with quiet clarity, the patterns aligning exactly as she knew they would. The resistance, the deflection, the attempt to hold on to control even as it slipped, and she leaned back slightly into her seat, her voice calm, precise, cutting through the noise without rising above it. "You are not questioning the system," she said, her eyes fixed on the attendant. "You are questioning me." And that distinction landed heavier than anything else, because systems can be fixed, errors can be explained, but bias, once exposed, has nowhere to hide. And for the first time since the moment began, the attendant did not respond immediately. Her silence brief but telling, and in that silence, the cabin shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for people to start seeing what was really happening. Enough for the narrative to lose its grip. Enough for the truth to begin pressing its way to the surface. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not the kind that fades naturally but the kind that forces people to pick a side. And for the first time since the moment began, the energy in the cabin no longer leaned entirely toward the crew. It hovered, uncertain, waiting, watching, and the male crew member cleared his throat softly, shifting his weight again as he looked down at the boarding pass still in his hand, then back at the device, then at Danielle, as if trying to reconcile three versions of the same truth that refused to align. "The system shows confirmed," he said finally, his voice lower now, less authoritative, more cautious. And that single sentence landed heavier than anything else spoken so far, because confirmation is not opinion, it is fact, and facts have a way of dismantling narratives when people are willing to let them. But the attendant was not willing, not yet, her jaw tightening as she stepped forward again, reclaiming space that had begun to slip away. "That does not change protocol," she insisted, her tone sharper, more rigid, as if structure could restore control. "We still need to verify identity." And there it was again, another layer, another shift, because the target kept moving, and the passengers could feel it now, that subtle recalibration that happens when justification replaces reason. And behind them, the young woman who had spoken earlier leaned fully into the aisle this time, her voice stronger, more certain. She already showed her identification at the gate. "I was right behind her," she said, and a few heads turned toward her, not just acknowledging her presence now, but listening. Actually listening, because witnesses change everything. They disrupt the illusion of isolation. They turn a private judgment into a public moment. And Danielle's eyes moved briefly in her direction again, a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to acknowledge that she was no longer standing alone in the space. And across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer shifted again, his earlier confidence replaced by discomfort, his gaze dropping for a second before returning, quieter now, less certain, because the situation was no longer simple. And simple is what people rely on when they want to judge quickly. And the male crew member inhaled slowly, then looked at the attendant, not confrontational, not challenging, but questioning, a silent exchange passing between them that spoke louder than words. And for a moment, she did not meet his eyes, and that moment, brief as it was, cracked something open, because certainty does not look away, and the cabin felt it, that shift, that subtle but undeniable turn where authority begins to lose its edge. And Danielle leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, not defensive, just present, her voice calm, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "You have everything you need to correct this," she said, each word deliberate, measured, leaving no space for misinterpretation, and the weight of that statement settled over the crew like pressure, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, undeniable. And the male crew member nodded once, slowly as if coming to a decision he could no longer avoid, and he turned slightly toward the attendant, lowering his voice, but not enough to be completely unheard. "We should call operations and confirm," he said, and that suggestion, simple as it sounded, marked the first real break in alignment, because now it was no longer one voice against another, it was internal doubt, and internal doubt is where control begins to collapse. And the attendant's expression tightened further, her posture rigid, caught between doubling down and stepping back, and for the first time since the interaction began, the outcome was no longer entirely in her hands. The suggestion to call operations did not land softly. It landed like pressure, slow and building, because once escalation reaches beyond the immediate space, control shifts away from the people who started it, and the attendant knew that, her eyes narrowing slightly as she straightened her posture, doubling down on the only leverage she believed she still had. "There is no need to escalate this further," she said, her voice tight, controlled, but no longer confident, and that subtle change did not go unnoticed, not by the passengers, not by her colleague, and certainly not by Danielle, who had been waiting for this exact moment, the point where resistance turns from certainty into defense, and she leaned back again, her expression calm, almost reflective, as if the scene unfolding in front of her was something she had studied long before stepping onto this plane, because in many ways, she had, years ago, in another airport, another gate, another version of herself, standing in line, with a ticket she had paid for, wearing a blazer that still felt too new, too carefully chosen, and a gate agent had looked at her the same way, paused the same way, questioned her the same way, until someone else stepped in and said, "She is good to go." And even then, the apology had been thin, forced, as if acknowledging her right to be there cost more than denying it. And that memory did not fade. It sharpened. It followed her into every room, every deal, every boardroom where she learned. That silence was not weakness, it was strategy, and now, back in the present, 36,000 feet above the ground, that same pattern was playing out again, just with higher stakes and a much larger audience. And the male crew member exhaled slowly, clearly weighing the situation, his earlier alignment with the attendant now replaced by visible hesitation, because facts were stacking against assumption, and assumption, once exposed, loses its authority quickly. "We should still verify with operations," he repeated, this time more firmly, his tone no longer asking but suggesting a necessary step, and that shift, small but significant, marked a line, because now the decision was no longer hers alone, and the attendant's jaw tightened. Further, her control slipping in increments she could not stop. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she replied. But the words felt hollow, lacking the weight they had carried before, and from behind, the young woman spoke again, this time without hesitation. "No, you made it complicated when you ignored what was right in front of you." And a quiet murmur followed, subtle but present, because agreement had begun to form, not loud, not unified, but enough to change the atmosphere, enough to let the attendant feel it pressing in from all sides. And Danielle watched it all with the same composed stillness, her gaze steady, her breathing even, not rushing, not reacting, because she did not need to. The moment was already moving in her direction, and then, without raising her voice, without shifting her tone, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, the movement smooth, deliberate, unhurried, and as she unlocked it, the glow of the screen reflected briefly in her eyes, sharp, focused, precise, and she lifted it slightly, bringing it to her ear, not as a gesture of urgency, but as a step already decided long before this interaction began. "Connect me to operations control," she said calmly, her voice clear, measured, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest to her, and the words landed differently than anything else spoken so far, not defensive, not reactive, but authoritative in a way that did not need volume to be understood. And for the first time since the moment started, the balance shifted completely, not fully visible yet, not fully realized, but undeniable, because this was no longer about a seat, or a boarding pass, or a misunderstanding. This was about to become something much bigger, something the attendant could not control, and deep down, she felt it before anyone else said a word. The moment the call connected, everything in the cabin seemed to slow down, not because anything physical had changed, but because attention had shifted, fully, completely, from assumption to anticipation, and Danielle did not rush her words, did not raise her tone. She simply spoke with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly who is listening on the other end. "This is Danielle Carter," she said, calm, precise, and the name moved through the space like a quiet signal. Not everyone recognized it, not yet, but the way she said it carried weight, and the male crew member's posture straightened slightly, instinctively, as if something in the air had just recalibrated, while the attendant remained still, her expression fixed, holding on to control with a grip that was beginning to slip. "I need you to pull the active manifest and executive access logs for this aircraft," Danielle continued, her voice steady, each word deliberate, and there was no hesitation on the other end, no confusion, just immediate response, efficient, practiced, and that response was not loud, but it was visible in the way Danielle listened, the slight shift in her eyes, the almost imperceptible nod, confirmation without display, and around her, the cabin leaned in, not physically, but in attention, because now the moment had moved beyond the crew, beyond the passengers, into something structured, something official, something that could not be dismissed with tone or posture, and the attendant felt it. The change, the loss of control, even if she did not yet understand the full extent of it. "There is no need for external verification," she said again. But the words lacked conviction now. Thinner, weaker, as if even she could hear the difference, and the male crew member did not respond to her this time. His focus fixed on Danielle, on the call, on the process unfolding that he could no longer ignore, and from behind, the young woman watched closely, her earlier doubt replaced by quiet certainty. Because now it was clear this was not about a misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, something systemic, and Danielle lowered the phone slightly for a moment, just enough to speak into the space again, her voice calm, controlled, but now carrying an edge of finality. "You had multiple chances to correct this," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact. And the weight of that statement settled heavier than anything before it, because it marked a boundary, a point, beyond which things do not return to normal. And then she brought the phone back to her ear, listening again, and this time, when she spoke, her tone shifted just slightly, not louder, but sharper, more defined. "Go ahead and initiate review protocol," she said, and those words, simple as they sounded, carried implications no one in the immediate space fully understood yet, but they felt it, all of them. The shift from interaction to consequence, from moment to record, from opinion to documentation, and the male crew member's expression changed, subtly but clearly, as if something he was hearing, or realizing, had finally aligned, and he took a small step back, not out of fear, but out of recognition that the situation was no longer something he could manage locally. And the attendant's composure cracked just slightly at the edges, her eyes flicking briefly toward him, then back to Danielle, searching for something she could still hold on to. But there was nothing left, not control, not certainty, not even the narrative she had built, because now the truth was moving faster than she could contain it, and Danielle remained exactly where she had been from the start, seated, composed, unshaken, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had, and she had already accounted for it. The confirmation came not as a shout, but as a shift, a quiet but undeniable shift that moved through the cabin like pressure dropping before a storm, and Danielle listened for one more second, then lowered the phone slowly, deliberately, her gaze lifting from the screen back to the attendant, and in that single motion, something changed, not in her posture, not in her tone, but in the weight behind both. Because now she was no longer waiting. Now she knew, and the difference between those two states was everything. "You asked who I was," she said, her voice even, controlled, but now carrying a clarity that cut deeper than volume ever could, and the attendant froze, not physically, but internally, the kind of stillness that comes when instinct recognizes something before logic catches up, and the rest of the cabin leaned into the moment, because this was it, the point where uncertainty ends and truth steps forward, and Danielle held her gaze, steady, unwavering, not confrontational, just undeniable. "My name is Danielle Carter," she continued, each word placed carefully, leaving no space for dismissal. "And this aircraft operates under Carter Aviation Group." And for a fraction of a second, the words did not land. They hovered, suspended in the air as people processed them, as connections formed slowly, then all at once, and the male crew member's expression shifted first, recognition flashing across his face like a delayed signal finally reaching its destination, his posture straightening, his shoulders tightening as realization set in, while the attendant's composure cracked visibly now, her certainty unraveling in real time, because the narrative she had built could not survive that name attached to that ownership, and from behind, The young woman's eyes widened, her voice barely above a whisper. Wait, she owns. But she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to, because the room had already completed it for her, and Danielle did not raise her voice, did not lean forward, did not demand acknowledgement. She simply let the truth settle, let it do what it always does when it is given space. And then she added, quietly, precisely, you question my presence on an aircraft my company operates. And the weight of that sentence landed heavier than anything else, because it reframed everything that had happened, every word, every assumption, every decision, and turned it into something undeniable, something documented, something that could not be explained away as misunderstanding. And the attendant took a small step back without realizing it, her control gone now, replaced by the sudden awareness of consequence, real consequence, not hypothetical, not distant, but immediate. And the male crew member lowered his gaze briefly, the shift in his demeanor complete, because now he understood not just the mistake, but the scale of it. And Danielle remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, grounded, unshaken, her voice calm as she delivered the final line, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. You did not misread the system, she said, her eyes fixed on the attendant. You chose to ignore it. And in that moment, the cabin fell completely silent, not out of confusion, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because the truth had finally arrived, and there was nothing left to argue. For a moment, no one spoke, not the attendant, not the crew member, not even the passengers who had been whispering just seconds before, because the weight of what had just been revealed settled into the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude, quiet but undeniable. And then it happened, not with a raised voice, not with confrontation, but with authority, pure and structured. As the overhead speaker clicked softly and a voice came through from the cockpit, controlled, professional, unmistakably serious. All cabin crew, this is Captain Reynolds. And the tone alone was enough to shift every head forward, every ear attentive, because captains do not interrupt mid-boarding without reason. We have received immediate communication from Operations Control regarding an active internal review. He continued, each word precise, measured, carrying the kind of weight that does not invite interruption, and the attendant's posture stiffened instantly, her eyes widening just slightly, because now the situation had moved beyond her reach completely, beyond her narrative, beyond anything she could contain. All crew involved in the current passenger verification incident in first class are to step back and cease direct engagement, the captain added, and that sentence landed like a final line drawn across the situation, clear, irreversible, and the male crew member immediately stepped back, not hesitating this time, his compliance automatic, because authority had just been redefined at a level he could not question, and the attendant stood frozen for a second longer, caught between instinct and instruction, before slowly lowering her arms, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by the unmistakable realization that this was no longer a situation she could recover from. And the captain's voice continued, steady, controlled, effective immediately. All involved personnel are suspended from duty pending full review. And that was it. No dramatics, no raised tone, just a statement, clean and absolute. And the cabin absorbed it in silence before a ripple of reaction moved through the rows, not loud, not chaotic, but present, heads turning, eyes widening, quiet exchanges forming as the reality of what had just happened settled in, and the young woman behind Danielle exhaled softly, almost in disbelief, while the man in the navy blazer shifted again, this time avoiding eye contact entirely, his earlier smirk erased completely. And Danielle did not react outwardly. She did not smile, did not nod, did not acknowledge the announcement in any visible way, because she did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself. The system had responded. The consequence had arrived. And across from her, the attendant finally stepped back, fully now, her shoulders lowered, her gaze no longer fixed with certainty but scattered, searching, as if trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly, and the male crew member stood beside her, silent, composed, but clearly aware that the situation had moved beyond explanation, beyond correction, into something final. And as the overhead speaker clicked off, the hum of the aircraft returned, steady, constant, unchanged, but the space inside the cabin was different now, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, because what had started as a question of belonging had ended with something far more definitive: accountability, delivered not through argument, not through emotion, but through structure, through truth, through a system that, once activated, did exactly what it was designed to do. And Danielle remained seated in the center of it all, calm, composed, exactly as she had been from the beginning. The only difference now was that everyone else finally understood why. The cabin did not erupt. It did not celebrate. It did not need to, because what had just happened was not spectacle. It was correction, and correction rarely comes with noise. It comes with clarity, and that clarity settled over every seat, every row, every person who had watched the moment unfold from assumption to consequence. And Danielle remained exactly where she had been from the start, seated, composed, her posture relaxed, but her presence unmistakable. And for a few seconds longer, no one approached her, not the crew, not the passengers, as if the space around her had shifted into something almost untouchable, not out of fear, but out of recognition. And then the young woman behind her spoke again, softer this time, but steady. "I am glad you said something." And Danielle turned slightly, offering a small nod, not dramatic, not performative, just acknowledgement. Because moments like this were never about one person, they were about what happens when silence is broken at the right time. And across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer finally looked up again, his expression different now, not confident, not dismissive, but reflective, as if he was replaying his own words in his head, measuring them against what he had just witnessed, and finding them lacking. And that was part of it too, the quiet accountability that does not come from punishment, but from realization. And the aircraft continued forward, steady at altitude, the engines constant, indifferent to everything that had just taken place. And yet inside, something had changed, not just for the crew, not just for the passengers, but for the standard itself, because standards are not defined in policies alone. They are defined in moments like this, where they are either upheld or exposed. And Danielle glanced briefly out the window, the sky stretching endless and clear, and for a second, the reflection looking back at her was not just who she was now, but who she had been. Every version of herself that had walked into spaces where she was questioned before she was understood. Every moment that had taught her that dignity does not need to announce itself. It only needs to remain intact long enough for truth to catch up. And she exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in victory, but in closure, because this moment, like so many before it, was never about proving who she was. It was about revealing what others chose to ignore. And as the cabin settled fully back into its rhythm, conversations low, movements normal, the tension gone but the memory still present, Danielle spoke one final time, not loudly, not to command attention, but clearly enough that those closest could hear, her voice calm, grounded, certain. "I did not raise my voice," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "I raised the standard." And with that, she leaned back into her seat, the moment complete, the message delivered, not with force, not with spectacle, but with something far more enduring, truth that did not need to be repeated to be remembered.